I'm Evelyn, 72 years old, and while I was hospitalized after an accident, my son and his wife went on vacation with her mother. I didn't cry or confront them, I just quietly sold the house, and a week later, they came back and froze. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about standing up to family betrayal and quiet revenge. Trust me, what happened next will show you exactly what self-respect really looks like. I worked for 40 years in the finance department of Company A, retired with full benefits, no debts, and a completely paid-off home, the very house I raised my son in after my husband died when our boy was just 6. 3 weeks ago, I slipped while carrying a laundry basket down the stairs and landed on the floor hard enough to break my arm in 2 places, bruising half my ribs and needing an ambulance ride, 3 scans, and immediate hospitalization under observation because of my age and the risk of complications. When I arrived at the hospital, the nurse asked if any family would be joining me, and I told her, yes, my son lives with me, he'll come once he hears what happened, because I raised him alone, took no vacations, gave him everything, and covered the cost of his entire education, his wedding, and the loan that bought his car. It took 3 hours before he even returned my call, and when he did, the first thing I heard was his wife's voice in the background laughing about how they had to double-check the check-in time for their hot spring booking the next morning, followed by my son asking if the hospital had private rooms because he didn't want us to worry too much during the trip. When I asked if he was coming to the hospital that night, he said they were finishing packing and couldn't delay because her mother had been looking forward to this trip for months and they didn't want to waste the cancellation fee. They chose a hot spring weekend with her mother over checking on me with a broken arm. I told him I was scared to be alone and that it was my first time being hospitalized, but he replied that the nurses were trained professionals and that I was strong enough to handle a few nights without him. He said I had always been independent, that I'd be fine, and then he added that they'd be back in 4 days and would bring me something from the souvenir shop, like that would make up for abandoning me in a hospital bed after 38 years of sacrifice. She stood behind him on speaker and said her mother gets emotionally unwell if things don't go as planned, so canceling the trip would be too stressful and could actually make her mother sick. Her mother had a cold 2 months ago, and my son stayed home 3 days from work, making soup and rubbing her back every 2 hours. When I had the flu last winter and could barely move, they left medicine outside my door and texted that I should keep my mask on and not use the shared bathroom, like I was contagious garbage. I didn't raise a son to be cruel, but I apparently raised one who could be manipulated into forgetting who actually gave him a life. He said I could call the nurse if I needed help, and then he ended the call because they had to leave early in the morning and wanted to rest. I didn't eat dinner that night because I couldn't lift the tray with one arm, and when the nurse checked in, I just said I wasn't hungry because I was too humiliated to ask for help. I spent the night staring at the ceiling and replaying everything I had done for that boy, from walking through freezing rain to pick him up from school when he forgot his umbrella, to selling my jewelry to pay for his college books, to never remarrying so he would never feel abandoned twice. They told me I'd be fine alone, and so I decided I would be, but on my own terms, not theirs. I used my left hand to call a longtime friend from my civil service days who worked in real estate, and I asked her if she still handled private home listings because I wanted to get an evaluation while the house was still empty. She asked me if I was serious, and I told her that yes, I was very serious. I was ready to sell the house immediately, preferably before the month ended. She said she'd send someone over with papers as soon as I was discharged and that I'd need to start gathering documents, which I knew I could access digitally from the hospital using my ID and password. I had planned for my son to inherit that house someday, but now I was planning something else. The next morning, I called the bank using my patient phone, verified my identity, and requested to open a second account separate from the one my son had access to for emergency household expenses. I told them the account would soon receive a large wire deposit and asked that no one but me have any access to it, not even viewing rights, and I authorized withdrawal-only transfers via in-person requests. They asked me what the money was for, and I told them it was for peace of mind, and then I called a lawyer I had once consulted about updating my will and asked him about eviction protocols for adult children who never paid rent. He said if there was no written lease, 2 weeks' notice would be more than enough to satisfy the law. He asked if I was sure I wanted to do this, and I said yes, because they told me I'd be fine alone, and I believed them. I believed them enough to do something they never saw coming. After finishing all my calls from the hospital bed, I reviewed every financial file I had stored in System B and confirmed that the house title, tax records, and insurance policies were all still listed under my name only, with no co-owner or secondary beneficiary recorded, and I made a list of what needed to be retrieved as soon as I was discharged. I remembered the last time my son helped me carry groceries was over 5 years ago, and since his wife moved in, every family dinner I cooked was either criticized for being too salty or ignored completely when she announced they'd already eaten out with her mother. I had asked once if we could celebrate my 70th birthday with a small dinner, just the 3 of us, and my son had said they were already committed to a birthday trip for his mother-in-law and would be back late that weekend, handing me a plastic cake box from the convenience store and saying I could eat it later if I wanted. They threw her a dinner at a reservation-only restaurant that charged per head what I used to earn in 2 days of full-time work. I started counting in exact numbers how many times I had accompanied my son to the clinic when he was a child, 43 times before he was 10, plus 15 visits to specialists, 3 dental surgeries, and a dozen nights spent in hospital chairs when he had the flu so I could monitor his temperature every hour. Last year, when I had sharp pain in my right leg that made it difficult to walk, I asked my son if he could take me to the doctor, and he told me to use a rideshare app or ask a neighbor because he didn't have time and couldn't keep leaving work just because I was getting old. 2 months after that, his mother-in-law had a stomachache and he spent the entire day driving her between clinics and calling 3 different doctors for second opinions, then picked up steamed soup and vitamins from a specialty shop I knew charged 5 times what the supermarket sold for. When I asked for a second opinion about my leg, he said the free clinic would be fine and that I was overthinking, and I ended up waiting 4 hours by myself only to be told I had early-stage arthritis and needed regular treatment they never once helped me schedule. Her mother got 2 full health screenings a year every year, paid for entirely by my son, with lab tests and full diagnostics, and when I asked for the same thing, they said it was too expensive and unnecessary for someone like me. They never offered to help with cleaning unless her mother was visiting, and only then because they wanted the house to appear presentable. The rest of the time, they expected me to vacuum, mop, do laundry, fold clothes, and cook for 3 people, despite my knees aching and my fingers locking up when the weather shifted. I tried once to say I needed help, and my daughter-in-law suggested that I was just lonely and needed a hobby, recommending I try indoor yoga using a free phone app since it wouldn't cost anything. That same week, her mother received a 250,000 yen treadmill as a surprise health gift from my son, and they asked me to help carry the box inside because the delivery workers only left it at the door. I had allowed them to move in 6 years ago when my son said it would be better for all of us, that sharing a home would ease costs and we'd all benefit, and I believed him because I thought family meant showing up, not taking advantage. The house they lived in rent-free was one I paid off over 35 years with a combination of full-time work, side jobs, and sacrifices that included never buying anything new unless absolutely necessary. And yet they treated it like a shared space where I was expected to stay silent in the background. When they brought friends over, they asked me to, please stay in your room so we can have some privacy. And once I overheard her friend ask if I was the housekeeper, and no one corrected her. I was treated like a burden in the house I built from nothing. I had once planned to leave them the house in my will, assuming that all the years of loyalty, of giving, of working without complaint would mean something. But now I realized all it bought me was the illusion that love guaranteed respect. I never asked for repayment or praise. I only wanted acknowledgement, but what I got was dismissal. I remembered the day they told me they were trying for a baby and said they hoped I'd help with childcare since you'll be home anyway and it would save us on daycare. And I nodded then because I wanted to be part of something again. Now, even the child calls me by my first name instead of grandma, while her mother is referred to as sweet grandma, because that's what they taught him. He used to run into my arms, but now he walks past me unless he needs a snack or a toy fixed, and every time I tried to offer a story or show him photos, they'd say, "He doesn't need to hear about the past right now, Mom." I started assembling a spreadsheet, one column for expenses I covered, one for moments they dismissed me, one for every specific time I was told to stay out of sight or lower my voice. I wasn't documenting for revenge. I was documenting for clarity, because I needed to remember that I was not imagining the pattern. They were living comfortably while treating me like a ghost. They owed me nothing legally, but morally, they had taken everything I gave them and never looked back. They said I could handle being alone. So I decided to show them what alone really looked like, without me. The day after I finalized my financial preparation calls from the hospital, I had the nurse bring me my bag so I could retrieve my notebook where I kept all passcodes, access details, and the schedule of payments made toward the property over the past 20 years, because I needed to ensure that every record was accounted for before any paperwork moved forward. I contacted my attorney again to confirm that there were no probate complications if I sold the home before adjusting my will, and he said since there were no co-signers or outstanding liens, the transaction could proceed once I was discharged and able to sign documents in person, so I scheduled the listing agreement to be delivered to my hospital room. They had no idea that while they were sipping tea in a hot spring resort with her mother, I was completing asset transfers from my hospital bed with one hand in a cast. She once asked if I would mind folding their laundry while I was watching TV, as if my purpose was to exist in the background doing unpaid labor while they lived their lives uninterrupted. He once told me I should feel lucky that I still had a role in their household and wasn't sent to a facility like many people my age, as if sheltering him for decades was a favor to me. I had spent every holiday alone at the house for 3 years because they alternated vacations between her family and their own getaways, saying it was easier to keep me at home, so the dog wouldn't be confused. I didn't even know they had renewed their wedding vows abroad until I saw a framed photo appear on the living room wall and was told they didn't want to burden me with the travel. Her mother received a gift basket on every minor anniversary, even one marking the day she adopted a stray cat, while my birthday went unnoticed unless I reminded them, and even then, I was told they were too tired from work to celebrate. I once tried to initiate a conversation about inheritance planning so I could ask them what would help them most in the future, and my daughter-in-law said, "We're not really worried about that right now, just make sure the house doesn't fall apart before it's ours." That was the moment I knew the only thing tying them to me was square footage. Before my discharge date, I made sure the real estate agent already had professional photos scheduled and a private buyer list prepared so the listing would not hit public websites, and she confirmed interest from 2 cash-ready buyers who wanted immediate occupancy, which meant I could proceed without delay once the property was vacated. I called a moving company and arranged for my items to be packed and relocated within 2 days of my return home, giving them a list of exactly which rooms to enter and which to skip entirely, with instructions to separate my personal possessions from theirs. I instructed the bank to schedule a notary and cashier's check pickup for the day of sale, and then I called the condominium office where I had quietly toured a model unit 3 months earlier and asked to begin closing paperwork on the top floor unit that I had admired but never expected to own. She had once laughed when I asked to tag along on a furniture shopping trip and said there was no point in involving me because you won't be living here forever anyway. And when I asked what she meant, she brushed it off as a joke. He had asked me once to sign a paper he said was for utilities, but I reviewed it and saw it was a request to add his name to the property title, which I refused and never spoke of again. They treated me like a placeholder, not a parent. I timed every action so that the paperwork would be completed while they were out of town, ensuring that no resistance or interference could delay or block the transaction once I was ready to proceed. The moving company confirmed they would arrive the morning of their return, and I gave them access to every room except the master bedroom and storage areas where I had already relocated their belongings the previous week without their knowledge. I had arranged for a storage unit to receive their possessions and paid 6 months in advance, labeled each box by room, and left a printed inventory taped to the inside of the unit in case they ever decided to claim their things. I scheduled a full home cleaning for the day after the movers left and told the cleaner to discard any remaining perishables or trash, change the locks, and remove the family nameplate from the mailbox. They didn't know I had been preparing for years to disappear quietly. I told the lawyer to prepare a letter that would serve as official notice of termination of their residency due to the sale, and asked that it be mailed on the day of closing so there would be a paper trail in case they attempted to claim tenancy or object to removal. She once said in front of a guest that they were letting me stay in their home out of kindness, and I nodded in silence, even though I had bought the house outright before she even joined our family. The final wire transfer was scheduled to arrive in my new account by noon on the day of sale, and I had already given the agent power of attorney to sign on my behalf using the hospital discharge authorization as proof of urgency. By the time they were scheduled to return, the house would be empty, the locks would be changed, and their new reality would be waiting. I would be gone, and they would be left with exactly what they gave me. The morning I was discharged from the hospital, I signed the final real estate documents for my hospital bed, confirmed the sale price with my agent, approved the closing schedule, and authorized the transfer of funds to my new private account, all while my son and his wife posted vacation photos online of them soaking in mineral baths with her mother and captioning them with words like, "Family first." I paid for a private taxi using the remaining balance from my personal card, returned to the house quietly, entered with my key for what would be the last time, and immediately began the process of selecting what would come with me and what would never be touched again. I used a printed checklist from File C to determine which documents to remove from the shared study, taking all birth certificates, financial statements, tax returns, health insurance policies, and digital backups, leaving behind only outdated magazines and a folder labeled recipes that had been used once in 6 years. I packed every photo of my husband and our family that I had once displayed in the living room but had been gradually pushed aside and replaced with vacation photos from her side of the family, and I placed them in a secure lockbox for the moving team. I left their wedding album on the shelf untouched, because I no longer had any emotional connection to events that deliberately excluded me. The house was silent, which made everything easier, and I moved efficiently from room to room marking items with colored tags based on instruction codes I'd sent in advance to the movers, separating essentials from discardables and noting which items had resale value and which would be donated to local charities. The dining set I bought in cash with my first bonus was marked for donation, since it had become their entertaining centerpiece but never once included me at the table when guests were over. They held holiday parties in my house and asked me to stay upstairs. I labeled the kitchen appliances I had purchased as "remove," since I no longer intended to cook for people who treated my meals like leftovers they were forced to endure. I separated their belongings into wardrobe boxes I had ordered weeks earlier and placed every item in them carefully, even folding the clothes I used to wash, not out of kindness but out of finality, because I would not give them the chance to say I was careless. I gave explicit instructions to the movers to leave nothing of mine behind, to sweep every corner of the rooms I had lived in, and to store my boxes at the new condominium until I arrived for the final handover later that afternoon. The refrigerator was emptied of anything I had purchased, and the leftovers I had prepared before the accident, meals that no one visited me to ask about, were thrown out without comment. They spent 300,000 yen on a pearl bracelet for her mother's birthday, but didn't send me a single flower during my hospital stay. I left a letter on the hallway table in an envelope with both their names printed clearly, containing the notice of sale, the termination of cohabitation, the forwarding address for their storage unit, and a closing message that stated, without apology or warmth, that I had taken care of everything alone just as they expected. They took my silence for weakness, but I was never weak, I was exhausted. I changed the lock codes, confirmed the locksmith's arrival with a texted verification code, and instructed the security company to deactivate their registered access cards immediately. The cleaning service arrived on time and was given a checklist of tasks including removal of any personal items left in shared spaces, disposal of trash, sanitization of common areas, and removal of family nameplates from the entry system. The delivery confirmation from the storage company arrived just as I was boarding a taxi to the condominium office, and I signed the lease in person while transferring the balance from the house sale directly into the account listed under my new legal residence. The unit I chose required no co-signer, no reference, and no explanation. The concierge service was briefed that I was not accepting visitors without written approval, and my name was listed with a restriction tag in their building access system to prevent walk-ins or unregistered arrivals. My son once laughed at the idea of me moving out, saying I wouldn't survive more than a week without help, and his wife added that I should be grateful for what little inclusion I had left. They spent the final day of their vacation sharing photos of hotel dinners, gift shops, and scenic views, while I stood in my own legally registered property with a receipt in one hand and a new key in the other. I had dinner alone that night not because I was forgotten, but because I finally chose it. They chose a trip over my broken arm. They chose her mother's comfort over my survival. They chose silence when I asked for help. Now they would come home to silence louder than anything I'd ever said. The next morning, while they were likely still sipping tea at the resort with her mother, the movers arrived promptly at 8 a.m., followed my instructions to the letter, and began systematically removing every item from the house that I had marked as mine, starting with the bedroom where I had been sleeping alone for years despite it being labeled family shared space when we first moved in together. I watched in silence as each box was sealed, each drawer emptied, and each bag labeled, knowing there would be no confrontation, no discussion, no final exchange of words, because they had forfeited their right to those when they chose vacation over emergency. I left behind none of my records, none of my valuables, and none of the daily items I had purchased with my own savings, items which had been used by all three of them without thanks, including the washer I installed, the air purifier I bought when their child had allergies, and the internet plan I paid for monthly under my name. They once told a friend at dinner that I contributed to the house emotionally, but not financially, even though I paid every utility bill for 6 years straight because they forgot to transfer their share and always said they'd reimburse me later. I requested the donation truck arrive by 11 a.m. to remove furniture purchased before their wedding, including the table where I once celebrated his college graduation with tears in my eyes while they later used it for dinner parties I was never invited to attend. I packed the few gifts I had received from them over the years, a scented candle from a clearance rack and a mug labeled "Best Roommate Ever," and placed them in the trash without hesitation. They never gave me a single photo of my grandson, but their hallway had 6 framed prints of her mother holding him on every major holiday. I ensured that all their belongings, including their clothes, toiletries, baby items, electronics, and books, were placed neatly into pre-labeled containers delivered to Storage Facility D, and I paid the extra insurance so they could not claim damage or neglect on my part. The movers double-checked the attic, garage, and back room to confirm that nothing remained of my presence, and once the last item was loaded onto the truck, I instructed the locksmith to install the new lock system and disable the previous access codes linked to their key fobs. The only thing I left inside was a sealed envelope taped to the entry table, addressed to both their names, containing the legal confirmation of the house sale, proof of the wire transfer, contact information for retrieving their belongings, and a single final sentence informing them that I had fulfilled their request for distance and independence. They called me dramatic when I once said I felt invisible in my own home. By 2 p.m., the house was empty, the keys were surrendered to the agent, and I signed the final closing statement in front of a notary who congratulated me without knowing he was witnessing the quiet end of a 38-year relationship that had died long before that signature. They spent that same afternoon in a floral foot bath posting a video about self-care, while I transferred 10 million yen from the sale into an untouchable account I created for emergencies unrelated to anyone except myself. They never once visited me in the hospital, never once asked the doctor for my recovery plan, never once offered to help arrange transport or follow-up care. And when the nurse asked if I had family, I had to say yes with a straight face even though the truth was no longer relevant. I left behind their mail, their delivery packages, and their bills unpaid on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that said, "Forward to your new address, when you get one." They told me I was too sensitive whenever I brought up being left out of their family plans. I sent a final message to the bank confirming that my former address was no longer valid and all correspondence must go through my new P.O. box linked to the condo. Then I called the condo office to confirm my delivery boxes had arrived and asked the concierge to place everything in storage until I finished unpacking. I requested that my name be added to the restricted contact list, meaning no visitors could enter without my approval, and I submitted a list of people explicitly denied entry, which included my son and his wife, both of whom were listed with photo ID copies to prevent misunderstandings. I called the home insurance company to cancel the policy on the old property and redirect coverage to the new condo, then finalized the switch of my medical file to a clinic 5 minutes away from the building, where no one knew me and no one would ask questions. They once told me I was lucky to still be healthy, but never took a moment to ask how I stayed that way. I changed my emergency contact to a former colleague who had already agreed to step in if anything ever happened, and I left a message with my lawyer confirming the final clause in my will had been updated. My son would no longer be listed as beneficiary to any asset in my possession. They would not receive a house, a savings account, or a letter. They would receive absence, which was the only thing they had ever truly given me. The morning their vacation ended, I received an automated alert from the storage facility confirming that their access code had been activated for the first time and that the unit containing their belongings had been opened, which meant they had likely arrived back in town and discovered the locks on the house had been changed while the mailbox nameplate no longer displayed anything recognizable. I knew they would panic the moment they realized the keys no longer worked, the passcode had been deactivated, and the neighbors were unable to help because none of them had ever been properly introduced to me as anything more than our roommate. They had used my name for utility registrations, internet service, and household correspondence, but they had never once introduced me to their friends, their child's teachers, or even her visiting relatives, and now they would struggle to explain to anyone why their house was no longer theirs. The voicemail I received just after noon was garbled and rushed, his voice filled with confusion and escalating frustration, asking why the locks were changed, why their things were gone, and whether I had gone somewhere, as if I owed them answers after they abandoned me in a hospital bed and left me to fend for myself with a broken arm. I played the voicemail once, archived it under File F, and blocked his number before it could ring again, then submitted a formal request to the phone carrier to prevent any further texts, calls, or data messages from reaching my devices from any numbers registered to either of them. The letter I left behind explained everything, including the legal sale, the storage unit address, and the fact that my name had been removed from all shared accounts and services effective immediately, meaning all future responsibilities were entirely their own. They never invited me to a single school event or family photo, but expected me to babysit on demand without thanks or compensation. I received a second voicemail from his wife 3 hours later, her voice higher, strained, insistent that they had not seen this coming and that surely we could talk before making such drastic moves, as if I had not warned them 100 times in smaller ways over the years that I felt erased, used, dismissed, and replaced. She had once told her mother on speakerphone that she couldn't wait until they had the house fully to themselves, not realizing I was sitting 15 feet away folding their laundry with hands that still ached from decades of scrubbing, lifting, cooking, and caring. I uploaded both voicemails to a private drive under Archive Z, labeled the folder Post-Exit Attempts, and forwarded a copy to my attorney, who was instructed to intervene only if legal threats were issued, which I doubted would happen since they never once contributed a cent to the mortgage or the property taxes. The silence that followed their discovery stretched for 3 days, during which I completed my move into the new condo, confirmed the setup of all automatic payments, activated 2 new insurance policies, and registered with a local health service that offered at-home visits, ensuring I would never again have to ask them for help. On the fourth day, a delivery attempt was made at my former address by a floral service under their name, but the delivery was refused and rerouted to the storage unit, per the instructions I had filed with the agent managing the transition. They once said that everything I did was out of guilt for being a single mother, as if my life's sacrifices could be boiled down to pity instead of love. The concierge at the new building informed me that a man had come to the front desk asking for my unit number and insisting he was family, but I had already flagged both of them as restricted visitors and left standing instructions that they were not to be allowed into the building or contacted on my behalf under any circumstances. I submitted a written report documenting the incident and requested the security team file a log entry in case they returned. Then I added a second backup restriction by instructing the building to forward any attempted packages or letters from them directly to the legal office managing my estate. Every day for the next week, I received either a voicemail, an email, or a missed call notification from unknown numbers, all of which were ignored, documented, and filtered into a digital logbook I labeled Unacknowledged Appeals. I never responded because they had already shown me what I meant to them, and there was nothing more I needed to hear. They gave her mother a retirement trip, health screenings, and birthday gifts worth thousands, and gave me silence, chores, and a plastic cake afterthought. I spent those days scheduling lunch meetings with former colleagues who had sent handwritten get-well cards, confirming my attendance at a community event for retired professionals, and volunteering for a local mentoring program where no one would look at me as a burden or an afterthought. I invested part of the house sale proceeds into a modest portfolio I would use to support causes I believed in, education for single parents, emergency aid for elderly care, and career workshops for women over 60, because I knew what it meant to be disregarded while still having so much to give. I reviewed every entry in the spreadsheet I had kept for years detailing my contributions to the household, my financial support, my emotional labor, and my unpaid service, and I printed it once, not to mail to them but to remind myself that my memory was not flawed, that my story had happened exactly as I remembered it, and that no amount of guilt or pleading would rewrite it. I donated 10% of the sale proceeds anonymously to an organization that helps elderly women transition into independent housing after being displaced or mistreated by their own families. And when the director sent me a thank you letter with photographs of beneficiaries, I smiled and placed it in a frame on the same shelf where I once displayed photos of my son. They used me until they didn't need me, and then they left me behind. Exactly 9 days after their return, I received an official letter forwarded by the building concierge from Storage Facility D, notifying me that my son had emptied the unit and left without leaving any follow-up address or contact number, and that all contents were retrieved in full with no reported damage or missing items. I called my attorney to inform him that the transfer of responsibility had been executed, then finalized my updated will, removing both my son and his wife as beneficiaries of any remaining assets, and replacing their names with a list of non-profit organizations that had supported elderly women in crisis, because I no longer recognized either of them as family. The following afternoon, I was notified by a mutual acquaintance from Community Group E that they had moved in temporarily with her mother, the same woman who had been treated like royalty for years while I had been ignored, and I listened carefully as the acquaintance explained that her mother had reacted to the situation in a way neither of them expected. I was told that when they explained the situation to her, how they left me in the hospital, how I sold the house, how they had returned to find themselves locked out and displaced, her response was blunt and unsympathetic, and she made it clear that she did not support their decisions and would not allow them to stay indefinitely. The woman they had prioritized over me was now embarrassed by them. Her mother asked how they could justify abandoning a hospitalized woman for a vacation, and how they could expect shelter now from someone they had used as a reason to neglect the person who raised them. They were told they could stay for a week, no more, and that she didn't want her neighbors asking questions about why her daughter and son-in-law were suddenly living in a space she had designed for solitude. The same mother-in-law they pampered with spa trips and gifts refused to cover for their failures, and I felt no sadness when I heard this, only confirmation that the world still had the capacity for fairness. I learned through another contact that they had begun searching for rentals but struggled to pass the income verification checks since neither had listed stable employment after my son left Company B last year due to restructuring, something he had hidden from me while continuing to live in my house without contributing. She had never worked more than part-time and always relied on the assumption that one day the house would be fully theirs and that my pension would supplement their lifestyle. They used my name to create the illusion of stability while denying me a seat at the table. When her mother refused to co-sign their lease applications, I was contacted by a property manager from Rental Complex G, who left a message asking if I could verify their employment history or rental reliability, and I called back immediately to decline any reference and instructed him to remove my name from their records. They used to joke that I was old-fashioned for insisting on keeping paper records. But now those same records had become the trail of truth that validated every decision I made and every betrayal they had committed. The silence from their side turned from offense to desperation, with new calls appearing from unlisted numbers that I blocked without listening, and eventually the attempts shifted to emails from unknown senders claiming to be friends, asking for a conversation or a meeting just to clear things up, but I reported each as spam and forwarded the evidence to my attorney. They once said that talking about the past made things worse, yet now they wanted to rewrite that same past to suit their needs, pretending they hadn't ignored every request, every cry for inclusion, every plea for respect. I checked their social media accounts from a backup profile and saw no apology, no acknowledgement, just vague posts about starting over, about being misunderstood, about family being complicated, as if those words could erase the years they spent reducing me to a domestic placeholder. They told everyone they were shocked, but they were never blindsided. They were just finally facing consequences. I submitted my story anonymously to a newsletter focused on elder independence, detailing how I executed a full exit from an ungrateful family without conflict, violence, or public drama. And within weeks I was asked to speak at an event for women over 60 who were considering similar exits from emotionally abusive domestic arrangements. The organizer said the most powerful part of my story wasn't the sale or the silence. It was the planning, the methodical refusal to wait for kindness that was never going to arrive. I donated another portion of the sale proceeds, 2 million yen, to a legal fund for elderly women navigating property disputes with adult children who felt entitled to inheritance without responsibility, and I received handwritten letters from 2 recipients who had found the courage to leave their situations after reading the article. I created a living trust with a financial advisor from Company H to ensure that every yen remaining after my death would be allocated exactly according to my new instructions, and that not a single item could be contested by anyone claiming blood over behavior. They called me selfish for choosing peace, but never called themselves selfish for choosing absence. When I finally told a small circle of friends what I had done, the reactions were unanimous: relief, applause, and the kind of admiration that comes only when someone breaks free without asking for permission. They offered to help me host a small gathering to celebrate the new chapter, and though I declined the party, I allowed them to organize a group lunch at Cafe J where we all shared stories of what it meant to live for ourselves after years of living for others. I received a message through my building intercom the following week from my grandson's school, asking if I was still available as an emergency contact, and I responded formally through the school office stating that I had relinquished all such responsibilities and would not be participating in his upbringing moving forward. I was once the only person who knew his feeding schedule, bath routine, and preferred bedtime stories, and now I was no one, and that was no longer painful. They erased me from their lives while still depending on my presence to keep their own lives stable. So I erased their dependence and left them with exactly what they gave me: nothing. 2 weeks after they vacated the storage unit and failed to secure a lease anywhere nearby, I received an email through the public address attached to the community center's speaker directory where I had recently volunteered, sent under a different name but clearly written by my son, asking for just one chance to explain, and attaching a photo of the grandson I hadn't been allowed to hold in over a year, and I forwarded the email directly to my attorney with a note requesting that a formal cease and desist be drafted in response. They had once told me that the child got too overwhelmed around older people when I asked why I was never included in outings or school events. But I later saw their photo albums filled with a mother attending every ceremony, every picnic, and every holiday pageant as the proudly featured grandmother, while I was left to cook and clean behind closed doors. The cease and desist letter was sent within 48 hours, stating clearly that all forms of communication, direct, indirect, digital or physical, were to cease immediately, and that any further attempts would be documented as harassment and pursued accordingly. And I kept a signed copy in my condo file cabinet beside the updated will and donation receipts. The legal silence was respected for only 10 days before my building received a flower delivery addressed to me, containing no card but matching the name of the shop they had used in the past for her mother's birthday arrangements, and I instructed the concierge to decline the delivery, log the incident, and confirm that my non-contact order remained fully active in the system. They spent years treating me like unpaid labor but couldn't accept being treated like strangers after I finally enforced the boundary they had been building themselves since the day they moved in. They gave her mother spa weekends, pearl jewelry, and handwritten letters, while giving me leftover takeout and silence during my flu. The next message came through a church group I had not attended in 3 years. A printed note slipped under the door of a former member and relayed to me by phone, claiming that they were in crisis and wanted to make things right, but I recognized the handwriting immediately as my daughter-in-law's and once again provided the evidence to my lawyer for archiving. They never once tried to make things right when I was washing their dishes with sore wrists, when I sat alone on holidays, or when I asked to be included in decisions and was told I was being emotional or intrusive. I responded not with words but with the documentation they forced me to create: financial logs, itemized expenses, recorded calls, and transaction histories that showed how much I had given and how little I had been given in return, and submitted them in full to be attached to my legal file in the event of any inheritance dispute. They believed family meant unconditional access, not mutual respect, and had only begun to cry foul when their access was finally denied. They once refused to let me use their car to go to the clinic for a joint pain consultation because they said it would be inconvenient, only to rent a full van the next day to take a mother to a mountain resort that included door-to-door transport and premium meals. They told me I was lucky I had a home, then claimed it was theirs when they wanted control. The final attempt came through her mother, who sent a letter to the condo's administrative office requesting an in-person meeting on behalf of her daughter and son-in-law, claiming they were remorseful and seeking closure. But the administrator followed protocol, flagged the request, and escalated it to building management, who then alerted me. I wrote a short, formal letter declining any meeting, reiterating the previous cease and desist, and clarified that closure had already occurred the moment they chose a vacation over a hospital room, and I had nothing further to discuss with anyone who stood by and watched me be discarded. The administrator apologized for the inconvenience, praised my clarity, and confirmed that any future attempts would result in automatic removal from the premises and security involvement, which I authorized in writing to avoid ambiguity. They used my resources, my energy, and my presence for convenience, but never once offered protection, reciprocity, or even acknowledgement. They called me a burden behind my back, but cried foul when I stopped carrying theirs. I changed my last name legally 2 weeks later, reverting to the surname I had before marriage, and filed the paperwork across every legal, financial, and social system so that there would be no more trace of me connected to theirs. And with that, the transformation was complete. I informed the pension office, the hospital system, the insurance company, and the government registrar, and received updated identification, health cards, and account confirmations all bearing the new name, one they could no longer use to reach me, locate me, or benefit from by association. They once said I was too dramatic for wanting my own space, yet now they were frantically searching for someone who had already erased them entirely. The building held a resident forum 2 days later where I was invited to speak briefly about aging independently, and I accepted, sharing the basics of how I planned, executed, and protected myself without conflict or confrontation. And though I never used names, The message was clear to those who knew what it meant to be cast aside. After the forum, 2 women approached me privately to ask for advice about their own adult children, and I gave them a list of what to document, how to protect assets, and who to contact, because knowledge without sharing is just silence, and I had lived in silence long enough. They expected me to accept erasure and still provide loyalty. They erased me, so I erased the bridge back. 1 month after my final name change and permanent removal of all legal affiliations with my former household, I received a courtesy update from the family law attorney I had retained, who informed me that my son and his wife had made a last-ditch attempt to file a civil complaint alleging wrongful eviction, but the complaint had been rejected outright due to lack of legal standing, no co-ownership, no lease agreement, and documented evidence that they had lived in my home entirely rent-free for 6 years without contributing financially. They never once paid for electricity, water, gas, or groceries, yet tried to claim they had a right to stay in a home they treated as theirs only after it was gone. I instructed my attorney to keep the file open for another 90 days in case of appeal, but made clear that I would not be attending any hearings or mediations, nor would I acknowledge any letters, calls, or messages, even if delivered through intermediaries. They had their chance to speak to me when I was lying in a hospital bed alone with a fractured arm, but chose instead to pack for a vacation and leave me there in silence. The hospital records, call logs, voicemail transcriptions, and time-stamped receipts were more than enough to make their story fall apart, and when the lawyer read back the list of supporting documents I had quietly gathered for years, I told him to keep it all in a locked archive for future protection, should anyone ever try to rewrite history on my behalf. They once said I was too organized, that I kept too many records, that I was paranoid to print and save things that could be stored digitally, but those same documents now stood between them and the lie they wanted others to believe. They ignored every boundary until they realized boundaries could remove them entirely. Her mother, who had once been celebrated by them as graceful, kind, and deserving of all comforts, reportedly grew cold after being questioned by neighbors about the sudden arrival of her daughter's family and their unclear housing situation, and I learned through a third party that she had told them she was embarrassed to be seen supporting 2 adults who had discarded their elder and were now being rejected by her peers for their behavior. The very woman they exalted above me was now telling them to leave quietly and not drag her name through the fallout of their selfishness, and they were finally forced to realize that the pedestal they placed her on was not high enough to catch them when they fell. They moved out within days and attempted to relocate to a more affordable district, but were denied a lease again due to poor financial documentation and lack of references, and I received a report from my lawyer that they had attempted to name me as a former guarantor in a lease application, which was immediately flagged and blocked by the system because of the legal order already in place. They once said they never wanted to rely on anyone but themselves, but every step they took proved they expected me to be there no matter how they treated me. They failed to understand that trust, once broken, does not wait. I received an invitation to speak on a private panel for senior women navigating post-retirement autonomy, and I accepted under my new name, giving a detailed timeline of how to execute a quiet and legally irreversible exit from a toxic family dynamic, and the session was so well received that I was invited again the following quarter. I never once spoke about revenge or bitterness. I spoke only about clarity, documentation, and the courage to act without waiting for validation. And afterward I was thanked by women who said they finally understood that love is not the same as obligation, and obligation is not a life sentence. I began tutoring once a week at a community learning center where I was paired with young women in transition from foster care to independence, and I taught them how to track expenses, apply for housing, protect their names, and never let anyone guilt them into silence about what they deserved. They told me once I was old-fashioned for wanting structure, but it was structure that protected me when they turned their backs. They used my structure until they thought they no longer needed me, then begged for it back when their lives began to collapse. When my pension office called for their annual benefits review, I submitted an updated contact list and verified that no next of kin information was to include either of them, and I attached a letter stating that my emergency planning was now fully managed by a licensed firm with no family involvement. I began using a prepaid legal service for all contract reviews and instructed them to act as a barrier between me and any new inquiries connected to my past name or address, and they were provided with a digital dossier containing all prior legal correspondences, cease and desist notices, property transfer records, and inheritance exclusions. I met with a financial advisor and began allocating portions of my estate into time-released endowments for women's shelters and elder legal advocacy groups, ensuring that the full scope of what I had built would serve others who, like me, were once told they should endure in silence. They once told me I was being overdramatic for worrying about the future, but when the future arrived, they came begging for the very safety net they had mocked. They never thought the door would lock because they assumed I'd always leave it open. I updated my medical file with my new surname and listed my former identity as historical only, requested that all contact from prior connections be filtered through a gatekeeper agency, and ensured that all medical and legal staff understood I had no living dependents and required no family authorizations for care. They would never again speak for me, claim me, use me, or inherit from me, not because I hated them, but because they had made their position clear long before I made mine legal. They made me feel disposable, so I disposed of every tether that made them believe I was still waiting. 3 months after I moved into the condo and legally severed every tie to the people who had once lived in my house without paying a single bill, I received confirmation from the Legal Services Office that all documents connected to my old identity had been locked, archived, and assigned to a restricted access status, meaning that no family member or outside party could use my previous name to request medical, financial, or legal information without a court order, which none of them would ever receive because they no longer had any recognized standing. They had spent 6 years living in a house I built from the ground up with my own salary, my own sacrifices, and my own hands. Yet they never once acknowledged that it was my name on every tax record, my payment on every utility, my face at every emergency appointment when my son was a child crying through fevers and accidents. They stopped speaking to me like I mattered long before I stopped responding, and when I finally acted in silence, they called it betrayal. They told me I was too emotional when I asked for equal treatment, but now they cried to anyone who would listen about abandonment after decades of draining me dry. I received a final legal notice that they had made one last attempt to dispute the removal from my estate, citing moral claims of care and involvement, which was dismissed immediately by the court after reviewing the evidence package I submitted, containing years of financial logs, voicemails, copies of unpaid bills, photos of empty chairs at birthdays, and a dated statement from the hospital where I had lain alone. They argued they were family, but never acted like it when it counted. The court's rejection came with a written judgment stating that the petitioner failed to demonstrate any history of sustained support, shared expenses, or caregiving duties, and therefore had no reasonable expectation of future inheritance, and I instructed my lawyer to scan that judgment and file it permanently with all updated end-of-life documentation. I donated another portion of my savings to an elderly care grant in memory of a woman I never met whose obituary I had read weeks earlier, because she had died in a nursing home with no visitors while her adult children lived abroad, posting vacation photos as though nothing was missing from their lives. They once told me I was lucky to have people around me, but those same people vanished the moment I needed anything that wasn't convenient for them. I joined a new social group for older women who had been dismissed by their families, and each week I heard stories that echoed my own: a forgotten birthday here, an ignored illness there, a room in their own home that slowly stopped feeling like it belonged to them, and I shared my process without shame or hesitation. I watched as one by one, they began taking back their power, some changing locks, some rewriting wills, some finally daring to say that love without respect is not love at all. They taught me that I wasn't alone, just silenced for too long. I subscribed to a service that lets you schedule letters for future delivery, and I wrote 10, each addressed to a different organization, person, or cause I cared about, with instructions on how to distribute what remained of my resources when the time came, ensuring every cent of what I worked for went where it was deserved, not expected. I left nothing for the people who left me in a hospital bed and told themselves I'd understand. I built a new emergency contact tree with trusted neighbors, medical staff, and community members who had already done more for me in 3 months than my son and his wife had done in 6 years of living under my roof. I assigned one of the community leaders power of attorney for medical decisions and left behind a sealed envelope containing all my wishes, because I would never again give people a chance to stand beside my bed pretending they cared after spending years proving they didn't. They celebrated her mother with photo books and spa days and treated me like a live-in maid who overstayed her welcome. I spent my afternoons reading letters from charities thanking me for contributions that came at the exact moment they needed it most, and I kept each one in a binder labeled "What Was Earned," because I wanted to look back and know that every decision I made had created ripples of change where none existed before. They once accused me of making everything about the past, but now the past is what protects me. When I walk through the condo now, I pass shelves filled not with reminders of their life, but with confirmations of mine, receipts, statements, names of people who mattered, plans set in motion, and not a single trace of the ones who expected to inherit without effort. They abandoned me with the belief I would wait quietly until they were ready to return, but I spent that time rewriting every line of the story they assumed they controlled. They thought I was too old to start over, but they were too entitled to see they'd already been written out. I no longer wait for apologies from people who stepped over my pain to preserve their own comfort, and I no longer hold space in my heart for those who required my silence to feel powerful, because every legal document, every digital restriction, and every erased connection was not an act of revenge, but an act of self-preservation after decades of quiet dismissal disguised as normalcy. They built their lives around the idea that I would always be there regardless of how little they gave, but when they showed me that their loyalty only extended as far as convenience, I stopped pretending that blood should override betrayal. They spent years assuming that I would never leave because I had nowhere else to go, but I found peace not in confrontation, but in decisive, irreversible absence. I no longer read their messages, no longer ask mutual friends for updates, and no longer feel the ache that once sat in my chest every time I watched them walk past me in my own hallway like I wasn't even there. They once claimed I made them feel guilty for not doing enough, but guilt was only ever a reaction to truth, and truth is all I ever offered them in return for their neglect. I never wanted revenge, I wanted dignity, and now I have it written into every clause of my will, every policy on file, and every page of the legacy I rebuilt without their names attached. They abandoned me at my most vulnerable moment, and in doing so, freed me from the illusion that they would ever change, which is why I left nothing behind for them to return to, because what they lost wasn't just a house, it was the last person who ever believed they could be better.